You owe me $178,000 for the inconvenience of your existence. Richard Carter didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't have to, because the room was already quiet enough for crystal glasses to hum under the chandelier. It was his 60th birthday dinner, hosted in the private room of an upscale steakhouse outside Boston, the kind with leather chairs, framed black and white photos of old city skylines, and a wine list thicker than most novels. Family members lined the long mahogany table, cousins in tailored jackets, an aunt adjusting her pearl necklace, business partners pretending this was a celebration and not a performance. Emily Carter sat halfway down the table in a simple navy dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture straight, her face composed in a way that had taken years to master. Richard tapped the side of his glass with a butter knife and smiled as if about to deliver a sentimental toast. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and withdrew a sealed white envelope with her name written across the front in sharp black ink. He slid it down the tablecloth toward her plate, past the steak she hadn't touched and the glass of water she hadn't lifted. "Since you're almost 28, he said evenly, "I figured it's time we squared things up." A few uneasy chuckles fluttered around the table, thin and uncertain. Emily picked up the envelope without rushing, feeling the weight of several stapled pages inside. She opened it carefully, smoothing the first sheet against the table as if reviewing a contract at work. The header read, "Itemized costs, 1996 to present." Below it, neat bullet points listed numbers that climbed year after year. Infant formula and medical bills, $12,430. Elementary school tuition and supplies, $38,900. Health insurance premiums, $22,715. Clothing, extracurricular activities, miscellaneous disruptions, $14,387. At the bottom in bold a total, $178,432. Beneath that a final line in italics, "For raising an unwanted child." No one spoke. A fork scraped against porcelain somewhere near the end of the table, then stopped. Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, studying her the way he might evaluate a quarterly report. "I never asked for the timing," he added, as though clarifying a minor accounting error. "You derailed a lot of plans." The words were not new to her. They had lived in the walls of their house for decades, whispered during phone calls he thought she couldn't hear, muttered when bills arrived in the mail. She remembered being 8 years old, standing at the top of the staircase in socks, listening to him tell a friend that fatherhood had been an expensive surprise. She remembered the way her mother's eyes would lower whenever money was mentioned, as if cost and love could never exist in the same sentence. Now at 27, Emily read every line twice. Her expression did not crack. She did not argue that children are not line items or that parenting is not a loan agreement. She simply folded the papers back into the envelope with precise movements, aligning the corners. "You're serious?" an aunt whispered, but Richard only shrugged. "Life isn't free," he replied. "She's an adult. Adults settle their debts." Emily looked at him then, really looked at him, noticing the faint gray at his temples, the confidence that came from decades of being the loudest voice in every room. She felt the old sting rise in her chest, but it did not burn the way it once had. It cooled into something sharper, steadier. She placed the envelope beside her plate and offered a small, almost polite nod. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice even enough to disappear into the air. "Debts should be settled." And for the first time that evening, it was impossible to tell who had just made the bigger promise. Emily did not drive home that night. She walked 3 blocks past the restaurant, past the valet stand and the row of polished sedans, until the cold Massachusetts air thinned the tightness in her lungs. The envelope rested flat inside her leather tote, its edges sharp against her side with every step. Behind her, through the tall glass windows of the steakhouse, she could still see the faint glow of chandeliers and silhouettes leaning close together, already turning her into a story to be analyzed between bites of dessert. She imagined the phrases forming in hushed voices. Oversensitive, ungrateful, dramatic. The words had followed her since childhood, long before she understood their meaning. At 9 years old, she had learned to measure her worth in silence, sitting at the kitchen counter while her father reviewed spreadsheets at the dining room table, his pen tapping whenever she asked for something that cost more than $10. At 12, she had stopped asking altogether. When other children pinned drawings to refrigerators, she stored hers in a desk drawer, neatly stacked and unseen. Richard Carter had always believed that discipline created strength, that emotional restraint was a virtue, that affection should be earned like interest on a savings account. Emily learned something different. She learned that observation was power. She noticed which vendors her father trusted, which contracts he complained about, which months made him irritable because quarterly numbers fell short. She watched him speak at community luncheons about responsibility and long-term planning. The same man who once told her mother that raising a daughter had been a financial setback. By the time she left for college, she understood balance sheets better than most of her classmates. She chose finance not because she loved money, but because she refused to be frightened by it. Numbers, unlike people, followed rules. They did not pretend. They did not disguise contempt as humor. They either added up or they did not. Graduate school sharpened her further. While others networked loudly at conferences, she listened. She learned how companies disguise losses as investments, how debts could be shifted, how liability traveled quietly through paperwork. She built a career in financial litigation analysis, the kind that required patience and a tolerance for uncomfortable truths. Her office now overlooked a stretch of Boston Harbor, steel and glass reflecting morning light across her desk. On most days she arrived before 8, coffee in hand, reviewing case files that involved executives who believed they were untouchable until documentation proved otherwise. Her colleagues respected her precision. They trusted her instinct for patterns hidden beneath polite accounting. Richard never asked what she actually did. When relatives mentioned her job, he reduced it to something vague, telling people she worked with numbers. He preferred narratives he could control. As she reached her apartment building that night, Emily paused beneath the street lamp and removed the envelope once more. The paper felt less like an insult now and more like evidence. $178,432. An amount calculated down to the last dollar, as if childhood could be amortized over 27 years. She thought about the way he had leaned back in his chair, confident that the humiliation would land heavily enough to keep her small. He had expected tears, perhaps anger, something loud enough to confirm his authority. Instead, she had given him composure. Inside her apartment, she set the envelope on her kitchen island beside her laptop. The city hummed faintly beyond the windows. She did not open the document again. She did not need to. She already understood what he had given her. It was not a bill. It was a declaration of how he measured value. And for the first time she felt no urgency to defend herself against it. She only felt clarity. Debts, he had said, should be settled. She agreed. She simply intended to define the terms. The next morning, Emily arrived at her office before the sun had fully cleared the harbor, the glass towers along the waterfront reflecting a pale gray light that made the city look almost unfinished. She placed her tote on her desk, removed the envelope, and set it beside her keyboard without opening it, as if its presence alone were sufficient documentation. Around her, the floor was quiet, only the low hum of climate control and the distant sound of an early commuter train rolling into South Station. She powered on her computer and reviewed the case she had been assigned the week before. A mid-sized transportation company under investigation for irregular internal transfers that had not yet triggered regulatory attention. She studied the flow of funds, tracing them from operating accounts into subsidiaries and back again, noticing how small adjustments could conceal larger truths when repeated over time. It reminded her of something familiar. Patterns rarely revealed themselves through noise. They revealed themselves through consistency. At 10 o'clock, her colleague Mark stepped into her office doorway with a file in hand and asked if she had a minute to review a disputed expense report. She nodded and listened as he described an executive who had categorized personal expenditures as business development. Emily asked a few measured questions, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. She suggested a sequence of document requests that would clarify intent without escalating prematurely. Mark thanked her and left, unaware that the same analytical process unfolding on her screen was quietly shifting towards something more personal. During her lunch break, she logged into a public corporate registry database and searched for Carter Logistics. The company profile appeared instantly, listing Richard Carter as founder and chief executive officer. Revenue figures were modest but stable. She cross-referenced subsidiary filings, scanning for inconsistencies in reporting timelines. Nothing dramatic surfaced at first glance, only minor discrepancies in how intercompany loans were classified over the past 3 fiscal years. To most observers, they would appear harmless, the kind of adjustments accountants make to smooth quarterly volatility. To Emily, they were invitations. She printed several documents and highlighted specific entries, her movements calm, methodical. She was not looking for revenge in the reckless sense. She was looking for leverage, something measurable, something that would translate humiliation into language her father understood. That evening, she attended a small networking reception hosted by her firm at a rooftop venue overlooking the Charles River. Colleagues laughed over glasses of sparkling water and plates of past appetizers while discussing upcoming audits and regulatory changes. Emily participated when spoken to, but her mind drifted back to the envelope waiting on her kitchen island. $178,432. A number designed to reduce her life to a liability column. She considered how easily numbers could be reframed. A liability for one party could become exposure for another. When the event ended, she declined an invitation to continue the evening elsewhere and drove home through streets lit by steady rows of street lamps. Inside her apartment, she sat at her dining table and finally reopened the envelope, laying each page flat as though preparing evidence for arbitration. She studied her father's handwriting at the bottom, the confident signature that had authenticated every demand he had ever made. Her expression did not harden. It clarified. She retrieved a legal pad and began writing notes, not emotional reflections, but structured categories. Public defamation, reputational harm, documented statements made in front of witnesses, potential regulatory vulnerabilities connected to Carter Logistics. Each heading was underlined once. She paused only to calculate how long certain statutory limitations remained in effect, and whether any internal transfers might attract scrutiny if properly examined. Outside, the harbor lights flickered in the distance, steady and indifferent. Emily set down her pen and looked at the total on the final page one more time. She did not feel smaller than it. She felt precise. Her father believed he had quantified her existence. He did not yet understand that she had spent her entire life learning how to read the fine print. 3 days later, Emily requested a personal day from work, something she rarely did, and drove north along the interstate toward the town where she had grown up, passing familiar exits and faded billboards that advertised family diners and real estate agents who had been in business for decades. The February sky hung low and pale, and patches of old snow lingered in the corners of parking lots like forgotten receipts. She parked across the street from Carter Logistics, a 2-story brick building with a modest sign near the entrance and a row of company trucks lined up along the side, each bearing her father's last name in bold blue lettering. From the outside, the business looked steady, respectable, dependable. It was the image Richard Carter had always curated with care. Emily remained in her car for a moment, watching employees move in and out through the glass doors, men and women carrying clipboards, coffee cups, and cardboard boxes. She did not step inside. Instead, she opened her laptop and connected to a mobile hotspot, pulling up the public filings she had reviewed the night before. She compared them against a new set of records she had requested through a professional contact who specialized in transportation compliance. The numbers aligned in most places, but in others they shifted slightly, like a picture frame hung a few degrees off-center. Intercompany transfers labeled as temporary loans had been extended beyond standard reporting periods. Certain operational expenses were categorized in ways that reduced taxable income without technically violating policy, yet the pattern suggested a strategy designed to test boundaries. She took careful notes, not with indignation, but with the same detached focus she applied to any case. Her phone buzzed once with a message from her aunt asking if she was all right after the dinner. Emily did not respond immediately. She remembered the way her aunt had avoided eye contact that night, the way relatives had stared at their plates while her father presented his calculation as if unveiling a charitable donation. Silence had always protected his authority. She closed her laptop and stepped out of the car, crossing the street to stand on the sidewalk opposite the building. Through the tinted windows she could see her father's office on the second floor, blinds half drawn, a silhouette moving behind the glass. For a brief second she imagined what it would feel like to walk in unannounced, to place the envelope on his desk and demand an apology. The impulse passed as quickly as it arrived. She understood now that confrontation without preparation would only reinforce his narrative that she was emotional, impulsive, ungrateful. Precision required patience. Back in her car, she called a former law school classmate, Daniel Brooks, who had built a reputation in corporate compliance and regulatory defense. She explained in measured terms that she had come across a situation involving potential misclassification of internal transfers within a privately held logistics company. She did not mention her father's name at first. She described the documentation, the recurring adjustments, the possibility that an external review might interpret the pattern unfavorably. Daniel listened carefully and asked for copies of the publicly available filings. His tone remained professional, analytical. When she finally disclosed the company's name, there was a brief pause on the line, followed by a quiet acknowledgement that he was familiar with the firm. He suggested that if any party felt publicly defamed or financially pressured, there might be grounds for a formal demand letter accompanied by notice of potential regulatory inquiry. Emily thanked him and ended the call without committing to action. She sat in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and looked once more at the building that had shaped so much of her childhood understanding of worth. Richard had always believed that control was maintained through intimidation masked as responsibility. He had never considered that the child he labeled an expense had grown into someone fluent in the language of exposure. Emily started the engine and drove away slowly, not because she felt defeated, but because she understood that timing would determine everything. Debts could be settled in more than one direction, and she intended to choose the moment when the numbers would speak louder than any speech ever could. Over the next week, Emily did not rush. She returned to her office each morning at 7:45, her routine unchanged, her expression composed enough that no one suspected the quiet recalibration taking place behind her steady gaze. She reviewed depositions, annotated financial statements, and attended strategy meetings where executives debated exposure and settlement risk. Yet beneath the surface of her professional rhythm, a separate timeline was unfolding, one she controlled with deliberate restraint. Daniel Brooks sent her a preliminary memo outlining potential vulnerabilities within Carter Logistics based solely on publicly available information. The language was neutral but unmistakably serious. Repeated extensions of intercompany loans without clear documentation of repayment terms could invite regulatory scrutiny. Inconsistent expense categorization across fiscal years might raise questions during an audit. None of it constituted proven misconduct. All of it constituted risk. Emily read the memo twice, appreciating its measured tone. Did not accuse. It did not threaten. It simply outlined consequences that could arise if attention were directed in the wrong place. She forwarded the document to a secure personal folder and closed her laptop, allowing the silence of her apartment to settle around her. That evening, she drafted a separate document of her own. It began with a factual summary of the dinner. Date, location, names of individuals present. She described the envelope, the itemized charges, and the final line that labeled her an unwanted child. She did not exaggerate. She did not embellish. She simply recorded. She included the names of relatives and business associates who had witnessed the exchange, understanding that public humiliation carried weight when corroborated. The following afternoon, she requested a formal consultation with Daniel at his firm's office in downtown Boston. The conference room overlooked a busy intersection where taxis and delivery trucks moved in predictable patterns. Daniel listened as she recounted the event without visible emotion. When she finished, he folded his hands and explained that a formal demand letter citing reputational harm and intentional infliction of emotional distress could be drafted. Combined with notice that certain financial irregularities had come to her attention, it would present a choice. Either her father could retract his statements, acknowledge the harm caused, and resolve the matter privately, or the information could be escalated through appropriate regulatory channels. The power would not lie in outrage but in structure. Emily nodded. She understood structure better than anyone. On Saturday morning, she received a voicemail from her father for the first time since the dinner. His voice was brisk, almost casual, asking if she had reviewed the invoice and when he could expect a response. He framed the request as a lesson in accountability, as though he were still teaching her how the world worked. Emily listened to the message twice, then saved it. Documentation mattered. Later that day, she drove again toward her hometown, not to approach the company building this time, but to visit the small public library where she had spent countless afternoons as a teenager studying, while her father attended networking events. She walked between shelves of biographies and business journals, remembering how she had once believed success meant becoming untouchable. Now she understood that true security came from clarity, from knowing exactly where leverage existed and how to apply it without spectacle. She sat at a wooden table near a window and reviewed Daniel's draft of the demand letter, making minor revisions to ensure accuracy. The final paragraph stated that absent an immediate written retraction and financial settlement equal to the amount publicly demanded of her, further action would be considered. She chose not to increase the figure. $178,432. Not a dollar more. Not a dollar less. When she left the library, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. She felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vengeance. What she felt was alignment. For years her father had believed that money granted him authority over narrative, that by assigning a cost to her existence he could define its value. He had miscalculated one variable. Emily had grown into someone who understood the mechanics of consequence. And consequences, when properly documented and professionally delivered, did not require raised voices. They required signatures. The demand letter was sent on a Tuesday morning at 9:12, electronically and by certified mail, addressed to Richard Carter in his capacity as Chief Executive Officer of Carter Logistics, and as a private individual. Emily did not watch the clock when Daniel confirmed delivery. She was seated in a conference room reviewing a separate case involving a regional supplier under audit. Her voice remained steady as she outlined risk exposure for a client twice her age, explaining how reputational damage often carried costs far beyond initial estimates. She chose her words carefully, aware of the quiet symmetry in her own situation. By late afternoon, her phone vibrated with an incoming call from her father. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. His tone was clipped, restrained in a way she had rarely heard. He referenced the letter as though it were a clerical error, suggesting there must have been a misunderstanding. He insisted that the dinner had been a joke taken too seriously, that family matters should not be escalated into legal territory. Emily listened without interrupting. When he paused, expecting apology or retreat, she responded evenly that public statements carry weight, especially when made in front of business associates. She mentioned, without accusation, that certain financial reporting patterns at Carter Logistics might attract attention if circumstances became adversarial. Silence followed, heavier than any raised voice. Richard shifted strategies quickly, reminding her of tuition payments, of opportunities she had received. Emily acknowledged those facts calmly and returned to the central issue. He had assigned a monetary value to her existence and demanded repayment. She was simply accepting his framework. The amount requested in the letter matched his total precisely. Not a dollar more. Not a dollar less. He asked if she truly intended to pursue the matter. She replied that resolution remained entirely within his control. The call ended without closure. 2 days later, a formal response arrived from his attorney, proposing a private meeting to discuss settlement. The language was cautious, signaling concern without admitting liability. Emily agreed to attend under the condition that all communications be documented. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at a neutral office suite in Boston. When she entered the conference room that morning, Richard was already seated at the far end of the polished table, his posture upright, his expression carefully neutral. For the first time in her life, he did not appear entirely certain of his footing. Daniel sat beside her, placing a slim folder on the table. Richard's attorney spoke first, framing the dinner as a misguided attempt at humor, and suggesting a mutual misunderstanding. Emily did not react to the phrasing. She described the event factually, referencing witness names and the voicemail he had left requesting payment. She placed a printed transcript of the message on the table. Her father's signature confidence seemed to narrow as the discussion shifted toward potential regulatory review of internal financial practices. Daniel outlined in measured language how formal complaints could trigger external audits, which in turn could affect credit lines, vendor relationships, and long-term valuation. He emphasized that no allegations were being made at that moment, only that documentation existed which might warrant inquiry if the dispute escalated. Richard's gaze moved from the folder to his daughter. He had always believed authority flowed downward, from parent to child, from employer to employee. Now the dynamic felt altered, not through aggression but through alignment of facts. Emily did not raise her voice. She did not recount childhood grievances. She focused solely on the written statement labeling her unwanted, and the public demand for reimbursement. She reiterated the settlement figure, and the requirement for a written retraction acknowledging harm. The conversation lasted 90 minutes. At no point did she display anger. At no point did she plead. When the meeting concluded, no agreement had yet been signed, but the certainty in her father's posture had shifted. Outside the building, the late winter air carried a faint hint of approaching spring. Emily walked toward her car with unhurried steps, aware that the outcome was no longer speculative. The structure was in place. Her father had built his life on the belief that numbers granted him dominance. He was beginning to understand that numbers also carried consequence, especially when handled by someone who had spent her entire life learning how to read them without flinching. The settlement draft arrived 48 hours after the meeting, delivered by secure email with language that had been carefully sanded down until it felt almost polite. Emily opened the document at her desk just after 6 in the evening, long after most of her colleagues had left for the day. The harbor outside her window reflected the fading light in streaks of steel blue and gold. She read every paragraph slowly. Richard Carter would issue a written retraction acknowledging that his statements at the birthday dinner were inappropriate and harmful. He would provide a formal apology addressed to her and to those present that evening. He would transfer $178,432 to her designated account within 5 business days. In exchange, she would agree not to pursue further action related to the incident or initiate regulatory review, based on the documentation currently in her possession. The language was precise, controlled, and unmistakably defensive. She noticed that nowhere in the document did he refer to her as his daughter. The terms described her as the claimant. It was clinical, predictable. She forwarded the draft to Daniel with minor suggested edits to strengthen the acknowledgement clause, ensuring it referenced the exact phrase he had used at dinner. Accuracy mattered. The following afternoon Richard called again, this time without pretense. His voice carried a fatigue she had never heard before. He asked if the figure could be reduced, suggesting that the amount was symbolic, and that perhaps a lesser sum would demonstrate good faith. Emily responded that she was not interested in symbolism. She was interested in closure. The number had been chosen by him, publicly and deliberately. Changing it would imply negotiation over her worth. There was a pause on the line long enough for her to hear faint office noise in the background, printers humming, a door closing. He exhaled slowly and said he would review the revised draft. That weekend, a formal letter arrived at her apartment by courier. She placed it on the kitchen counter beside the original envelope he had handed her weeks earlier. The contrast between the 2 documents was striking. One had been an accusation disguised as accounting. The other was an admission framed as settlement. She opened the new letter and read his apology. The words were restrained, acknowledging that labeling her existence as an expense had been wrong, and that his demand for repayment had been inappropriate. He stated that the comments did not reflect her accomplishments or value. It was not emotional. It was not warm. But it was written. Monday morning, confirmation of the wire transfer appeared in her account statement. $178,432, deposited from Carter Logistics Holdings. Emily stared at the screen for a moment, not with triumph, but with a quiet recognition that something irreversible had occurred. Later that day, her aunt called, her voice cautious, asking what had happened and why Richard seemed unusually withdrawn at a family gathering the night before. Emily did not disclose details. She simply said that certain misunderstandings had been addressed. Word traveled quietly through relatives and business circles that the situation had been resolved. No one repeated the joke from the dinner. No one mentioned the invoice again. At her office, Emily maintained her usual routine, attending meetings, analyzing risk exposure for clients who feared financial scrutiny. She did not share her personal victory with colleagues. She did not need validation. What mattered was internal alignment. One evening, she drove past Carter Logistics once more. Not to confront, but to observe. The building looked the same as always. Trucks parked in orderly rows, lights glowing behind second-floor windows. Yet she understood that the power dynamic within those walls had shifted in a way that would not easily be undone. Richard Carter had built his authority on the premise that he alone determined value. Now he had signed a document contradicting that belief. Emily turned her car toward the highway and merged into traffic. The city skyline ahead illuminated against the darkening sky. She felt neither anger nor satisfaction, only a steady sense of balance restored. He had tried to convert her existence into a liability. She had converted his certainty into accountability. And in the quiet aftermath, she realized that the true settlement was not the money in her account, but the silence that followed, a silence no longer heavy with dismissal, but light with finality. Weeks passed, and the immediate tension dissolved into something quieter, almost unrecognizable. Emily did not make any public announcement about the settlement, and neither did Richard. The apology he had sent remained in her records, printed and filed alongside the original invoice, both documents resting in a slim gray folder inside her home office drawer. She did not revisit them often. She did not need to. The outcome had already shifted the landscape. At work, she found herself noticing subtle changes in how she carried herself. She spoke with the same calm precision as before, yet there was an added steadiness beneath it, as though a long unresolved equation had finally balanced. Her colleagues trusted her analysis more than ever, assigning her to increasingly complex cases involving corporate restructuring and compliance risk. She approached each assignment with disciplined focus, aware that the skills she had sharpened under personal pressure now served her professionally with even greater clarity. One afternoon, she received an unexpected email from the Regional Compliance Board, requesting a voluntary informational session for local business leaders on updated reporting standards. The invitation list included several transportation companies, among them Carter Logistics. Emily was asked to present on internal controls and reputational risk management. She accepted without hesitation. The event was scheduled for early spring at a conference center overlooking the harbor. On the day of the session, the room filled gradually with executives in tailored suits and polished shoes, their conversations measured and polite. Emily stood at the front beside a projection screen, her navy blazer fitted, her posture upright. When Richard entered, he paused briefly upon seeing her name on the program, but he did not leave. He took a seat in the third row, hands folded, expression neutral. Emily began her presentation with data rather than commentary, outlining how minor reporting inconsistencies could escalate into significant exposure if not addressed proactively. She explained how public perception often amplified financial risk, and how leadership accountability served as a stabilizing force within organizations. Her tone remained professional, free of personal undertones. She did not look directly at her father as she spoke, yet she was aware of his presence. Midway through the session, she referenced a hypothetical scenario in which a company's internal communications undermined trust among stakeholders. She described how careless statements, even if framed as humor, could damage credibility and require costly remediation. The room listened attentively, some nodding as they took notes. When she opened the floor for questions, Richard raised his hand. His voice when he spoke was controlled, almost reflective. He asked how leaders could rebuild trust after making public errors in judgment. The question hung in the air with quiet weight. Emily met his gaze briefly before responding. She stated that transparency, acknowledgement of harm, and measurable corrective action were essential. Trust, she explained, could not be demanded. It had to be re-earned through consistent behavior. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet the shift in dynamic was unmistakable. The audience saw only a professional dialogue between an executive and a compliance analyst. They did not see the history behind it. After the session concluded, attendees approached Emily to thank her for the clarity of her insights. Richard remained seated until the room had mostly emptied. When he finally stood, he walked toward her with deliberate steps. He did not attempt small talk. He simply said that her presentation had been thorough and well delivered. The compliment was restrained but sincere. Emily acknowledged it with a polite nod. There was no lingering hostility in her expression, only composure. Outside the conference center, the harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and early spring air. Emily watched as executives dispersed into waiting cars and rideshares. She felt no need to revisit the past or to emphasize what had already been resolved. The apology letter and the wire transfer had closed one chapter. What remained was something more subtle. Richard Carter had once believed he could define her through numbers. Now he had witnessed her define the standard by which numbers were judged. And in the quiet professionalism of that conference room, the final recalibration took place, not through confrontation, but through undeniable competence. Summer arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way most permanent changes do. By June, the harbor outside Emily's office reflected a brighter blue. Sailboats cutting slow white lines across the water while tourists gathered along the docks. Her schedule had grown fuller, her name appearing more frequently on internal memorandums tied to high-visibility cases. She did not seek the recognition, yet it followed her with increasing consistency. Competence, when repeated often enough, becomes reputation. One evening, she received a formal invitation to a regional business association banquet honoring companies that had demonstrated improved compliance standards and community engagement over the past fiscal year. Carter Logistics was listed among the honorees for implementing updated reporting protocols and internal review systems. Emily understood the irony immediately. She also understood the intention behind the invitation addressed to her specifically as a featured compliance speaker. The banquet was held in a renovated historic hotel ballroom, overlooking the Charles River. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished floors, and round tables were arranged with white linens and understated centerpieces. Executives and their families moved through the room in tailored suits and evening dresses, the atmosphere polished but measured. Emily arrived alone, her attire simple and refined, her posture composed. When Richard entered later that evening, there was no hesitation in his step, but there was something different in the way he scanned the room. Not for dominance, for alignment. During the program, a moderator highlighted the importance of ethical leadership and transparent reporting in sustaining long-term success. Carter Logistics was recognized for adopting stricter oversight measures and engaging external advisors to strengthen internal accountability. Applause followed, respectful and steady. Richard walked to the stage to accept the acknowledgement. His speech was concise. He thanked his team and emphasized that growth required reflection and adaptation. At one point, he referenced the influence of strong professionals in the compliance field who held businesses to higher standards. He did not mention his daughter by name, yet his gaze found her briefly in the crowd. The recognition was subtle but unmistakable. Later in the evening, Emily was invited to offer closing remarks on corporate responsibility. She stepped to the podium with calm assurance, the room settling into attentive silence. She spoke about how numbers tell stories beyond profit margins, how integrity is not a line item but a continuous practice. She explained that accountability does not weaken leadership, it strengthens it. Her tone was measured, free of accusation or triumph. She did not recount personal history. She did not allude to past conflict. She focused on principle. When she concluded, the applause carried a warmth that was neither dramatic nor forced. It was earned. As guests began to disperse, Richard approached her near the edge of the ballroom. The music was soft, the conversations around them low and indistinct. He stood beside her rather than in front of her, a small shift that did not go unnoticed. He said that the company had benefited from re-examining its systems, and that he had underestimated the value of certain perspectives. It was not an emotional confession. It was an acknowledgement. Emily listened without interruption. She replied that growth was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Their exchange lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it carried more weight than any argument they had ever had. Outside the hotel, the evening air was warm, carrying the faint scent of the river. Emily walked toward the parking garage, heels clicking softly against the pavement. She did not feel vindicated. She felt settled. The money transferred months earlier remained invested in a diversified portfolio under her name, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that valuation can be reclaimed. The apology letter remained filed away, Not as leverage but as closure. Richard Carter would continue running his company. She would continue building her career. Their lives would intersect at family gatherings and community events, but the hierarchy that once defined them no longer existed. He had attempted to measure her existence in dollars. She had responded by demonstrating that worth is not assigned. It is embodied. As she drove home along the river, city lights reflecting across her windshield, she understood that she had not defeated her father. She had outgrown the need to. The true victory had never been about repayment. It had been about redefining value on her own terms. And in the quiet hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of traffic, there was nothing left to prove.